These days, a lot of people are paying much more attention to their health and wellness. There's certainly lots of information out there that can address all kinds of lifestyle issues in terms of chronic health, or if you're looking to follow a specific nutritional plan, etc. There is one piece that is so important, and yet many people do not understand. And I really feel that this is a foundational piece to wellness, which is why I'm so happy to have my guest, Dr. Sam Shay, here today. We are talking about your genes, not the ones you wear, the ones inside. And as part of that, we are also talking about methylation, which may be something you don't know a lot about, but Dr. Sam is going to break it down for us. Sam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's really great to speak with you. And this topic on methylation has really rocketed into the public consciousness. And the impetus for doing this topic came from, of all things, a Joe Rogan podcast. And I'll actually share for people that are listening only. I'll talk. I do have a visual presentation because some of this material can be a bit technical, but I will speak in a way that it's as understandable as possible, just from verbal only. But I do encourage at some point possibly looking at the video version, if you're not looking at this already, because there is
Mhm.
methylation does have some complexity to it that's easier explained in visuals. So methylation, in short, is a body's. It's you take on and you take off a carbon off of a molecule, which to people who aren't really in the biology or health field, it's not really clear why is that such a big deal. It's a really big deal because the shape of a molecule determines its function. And when you add a carbon to, well, technically it's a carbon and three hydrogens. When you add a carbon group to a molecule, you change it, and this body uses it as signaling mechanisms and to fundamentally alter one thing into another. So you use methylation in so many processes, it's been elevated to the status of the most important thing. Now, and that's what Gary Brecka asserted on the Joe Rogan podcast back late last year, 2023. And basically, his claim was that there were five major genes, methylation genes, that people had to get done. And those were the most important genes ever. And if you just know those five, you're going to be super set for life as the most important things. And to Gary's credit, he's an excellent public educator on complex health topics. He's very, very good at distilling down complex topics into simple, understandable terms. He covered a lot of ground in that 2+ hour podcast. I really appreciated how well he's able to simplify things. My criticism is not in his pedagogical method. My criticism is he oversimplified the
Mm.
that's the criticism. I admire this man's background as an actuary or a health insurance actuary, where he has a very unique lens on health. Appreciate that. Appreciate the skill set he's developed, the business he's built, the people he's helped, the structure he's done that. No issue. It's the oversimplification of this gene part that I kind of, my fur went up on the back of my neck, and I was like, that's way too simplistic, and I feel doesn't have a full picture. So that's what I'm going to discuss today.
And I do have a question for you because there are so many at-home tests that are coming out. I was astonished to see them on the shelf at CVS the other day.
Oh yeah.
And so how are people supposed to understand what they really need and then what to do with that information?
That's an excellent question. So it comes down to what your goal is with genetics. So there are many different ways to work with genetics. One is to find out, what percentage Irish you are. And that's not the type of testing that I do.
Mhm.
And so that's genealogical testing. And then there is genetic testing for understanding what the inherited genetic fault lines
Mm.
you've got that you have to shore up and do your best to work on mitigating their manifestation, that the risks you've inherited. And the other thing about genetics is that it can tell you what your optimal direction is. So, for
Mhm.
example, There's gene testing right now to figure out, are you optimally a paleo, a keto, a Mediterranean, or a high carb diet?
Mm,
And the shades of gray in between them all. And that's not about, what percentage Irish you are, though if you are genetically more prone towards keto or paleo, it's very likely your genealogy came from a more came from a part of the world long term where it was more of a hunter gatherer because you didn't have enough carbs to go around to necessitate the increased copy numbers of the ABE1 gene to break down more carbohydrates by secreting more amylase. And again, that's a kind of a word salad for the technical minded folks.
yeah.
But basically, if you went through the micro pressure of of a culture of 5, 10,000 years of agriculture, then then there's a genetic predisposition to being able to metabolize more carbohydrates.
Mm,
So you can infer some things from that, but it's not the, what percentage Irish you are.
sure.
So genetic testing, there's several types of genetic testing as it relates to health and well-being. There's the genetic testing that is very disease focused and kind of it's the Western medicine equivalent of germ theory. You got one germ causes one disease, and in Western medicine and a lot of genetics, like one gene causes one disease, or one gene causes all these other things, and you're screwed. Here's your medication or whatever it might be. Then there's the functional genetics,
Mm,
the more like functional medicine. Like there's Western medicine, then there's functional medicine, and there's Western genetics, and there's functional genetics. Functional genetics, it's more focused on what are the overarching genes that aren't specifically related to diseases, but are in control of all the processes that can poke on the quote unquote disease genes downstream. So for the genetic tests that I run, I don't look for the stroke gene, the cancer gene, the diabetes gene, the dementia gene. I don't look for those. I look at the genes that control inflammation,
mm,
that control quenching free radicals in the mitochondria, where 95% of all free radicals are made. I look at
mm,
the genes that are the pivotal genes for phase one, phase two liver detox. I look at the genes that control vitamin D, both synthesis from the sun and absorption in the blood into the cells, which is a separate set of genes. I look at methylation genes, of which there are about a dozen and a half, plus or
mm,
minus, not five.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, just circling back.
Yeah.
I look at the major genes for cardiovascular circulation and pressure, and then I look at a bunch of genes for fat energy metabolism. So those 7 categories: inflammation, free radical damage, scavenging, liver detox, vitamin D utilization, methylation, cardiovascular circulation, and fat energy metabolism. Those are the drivers of the
For
disease process
everything else. Mm,
under. So now I'm not saying it may be valuable to look at the more downstream genes, but that's not functional genetics. That's
mhm,
Western genetics.
right.
And if I'm looking at genetics from a well-being coaching model, it's not about I am treating a genetic disease. It is
Mhm,
how can I optimize your lifestyle, diet, nutrition, etc., based on the genes you have to epigenetically change the expression of those 7 categories of genes so that the body is less prone to inflammation, less prone to being overwhelmed by free radicals, less prone to be overwhelmed by toxic chemicals, less prone to be stricken with failure to synthesize or absorb vitamin D, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the model that I approach. Gary is looking at a grand total of 5 methylation genes.
mhm.
I personally look at over 100 for the people
Wow.
that work with me, and it's not much more than what Gary's charging for his 5, just to be really frank. So that's the overarching picture of like why people would do genes.
Mhm,
There's a huge variation in the value for investment. Now, I personally think everyone should do a really solid genetics test to, again, identify the genetic fault lines, and identify where your optimal is going
Mhm.
forward, because it's the most valuable test for your health and well-being, amortized over however many decades more you want to live. And then all of the tests on the planet, because you got to like redo mitochondria tests every 6 to 12 months, adrenal tests, gut
Mhm.
tests, whatever. All those functional tests you got to redo.
This is a once in a lifetime test.
This is
Yeah,
a one-off thing for the genes that are being
yeah,
tested. Now,
yeah.
again, the gene genetics field is expanding continuously, so you
Mhm.
may need, maybe in air quotes, it may be beneficial to get some other genes tested in the future as more research comes out. But there is no single better investment in someone's long-term health and well-being than doing a solid genetics test. This is not even a close second.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things that's really important to point out to people is that this is part of a holistic approach to addressing health and well being, because you can be making what you think are all the right dietary lifestyle moves. But if you don't know that that's what your body is actually going to respond to, for example, someone who chooses to do a keto or a paleo diet, and it turns out they're really not optimally geared to do that,
Correct.
they're not helping themselves.
I had the reverse situation when I did my genetics test. I was eating a perfect, and I mean perfect, Mediterranean diet, down to like I knew the names of my farmers and their chickens. Like, and it was not, I was not doing well. And then I ran my genetics, and it turns out I have the second lowest carb tolerance you can have. I'm basically a keto, bordering on paleo. I just call it peto.
Mm.
Done that before. Anyway, it's a new word, TM, peto. So PETO. Yeah.
Yeah.
So uh,
So
so
what are some of the other genetics that people should be looking at? Like, what are some of the other things to keep in mind?
So, well, let's just look at the methylation map. So
Sure.
already mentioned five. Here's a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And there's also MTHFR2 in there as well. So here's 12, 15 just right there at the moment. And as you can see, methylation is quite complicated.
Mm.
And what Gary spoke about
So
has
sorry to interrupt. Just one in like 2 sentences, can you please explain what methylation is for anybody who's like, "I don't know what we're talking about?"
so methylation is the ability to add a carbon and take off a carbon off of a molecule. And that's important because there's certain molecules that in one form are dangerous, like homocysteine. And then in another form, when they've gone through the methylation cycle, they're now back to they're turned back into methionine, so that now they're a useful amino acid. Or in some cases, when they go through a slightly different pathway, they go through what's called the transsulfuration pathway, and they become glutathione. So homocysteine is a uniquely damaging molecule, and it's so damaging that the body has created three separate exit strategies to
Mm.
get rid of it. There's the indirect pathway, there's the folate cycle called the direct pathway, which is one of the things that Gary tests for, and then there's the transsulfuration pathway to convert it into, of all things, glutathione. So, when we look at methylation, it's much more than just 5 genes. And additionally, methylation is not the top of the food chain when it comes to
Mhm.
causation in the body. It's inflammation. So, and these are, and for people listening, the slide I'm showing is like a list of multiple publications off of PubMed that are showing, with the citations, showing how inflammation is, it controls methylation, and at a minimum is bidirectional. So for someone to say methylation controls everything is inaccurate.
Mhm.
There's proven processes that inflammation actually controls methylation. And and it just shows some examples of like, here are 15 major inflammatory genes, the 15 major genes that I analyze.
Mhm.
And we then, for people watching, and don't lose your vision squinting so hard to read the hieroglyphic hexadecimal designations of these genes. It's just a big picture analysis that if someone is globally prone to inflammation, like I am,
Mhm.
that they are just way more prone to inflammation, and that means that their methylation cycle is going to be screwed up. So the key is to work upstream and focus on inflammation first, or at least in tandem, and not fixate on a the MTHFR gene. Like I think fixating on MTHFR is a mistake.
Mhm.
because many things above MTHFR that control it. So, and I'll give you another example of how the genetic testing really helped me because I had terrible joint pain like an 80-year-old man in my 30s. And I was taking fish oil. I was doing, clean lifestyle, clean diet, farmers, chickens, knew their names, etc. So the issue is that I didn't understand why my joints were hurting. And then I ran my genetics and I realized I was a hyperinflamer genetically.
Mhm.
And what, so there's a, and I've been taking fish oil, for example. There's like a very key list of things to do. But what the issue is dosing. There's nutritional dosing, and then there's a term called nutrigenomic
So,
dosing.
yeah.
And that is a very different understanding that I had no consciousness for until I studied genetics. So nutritional dosing is here's your 1 gram of fish oil that it says on the bottle to take every day, and those fish, it's great. They're fish oil, they're wonderful, they're clean, they're good company, reputable, such et cetera. And those are just throwing widgets into the machinery. That's
Mhm.
nutritional dosing. Nutrigenomic dosing is you give a way higher dose. In my case, it was over 4 grams, uh, and it was actually more but a bit more than that. Admit this is not prescriptive. Do not do this. This is just me.
Yeah, and this is something where if you're looking for nutrigenomic values, you
Just
must
work with
be working with the
with a coach. Yeah,
practitioner. This is not
absolutely.
something you do on your own.
So I had way higher doses, and the difference between 1 gram and much more is that the 1 gram was widgets in the machinery. The higher doses change the machinery. That's the
Mhm,
difference. The higher doses actually trigger the epigenetic change in the expression of the inflammatory genes to make me less inflamed overall, not just merely trying to process, like not just processing whatever's going on in the system already. It actually changes the machinery. And by changing the inflammatory state at its root, and of course, I'm looking for any outside things that cause inflammation, but genetically, all environmental stimuli are filtered through my genetics, and I can have a great lifestyle, but if I'm hyper inflamed, a great lifestyle will still come out inflamed on the other end unless I change the filter in which the environmental stimuli go through. And that's what nutrigenomic dosing and nutrigenomic lifestyles do, is we're
mm,
changing the filters in which the environmental inputs are going through. So then we've got oxidative stress, and that's a word for free radicals. And this is just papers citing how free radical damage changes methylation. So if this is again another thing to show that I'll just read oxidative stress on complex traits and disease may be partly mediated through changes in epigenetic markers, e.g. DNA methylation, meaning oxidative stress causes methylation changes.
mm,
That's the that's the oxidative controlling methylation. And then, so people understand what oxidative stress, what happens is in the mitochondria, which is the basically it's the power plant to run the cell. So a cell is like a mini city, and you need power plants and electricity to run the city. And the importance of that is pretty straightforward. If New York or LA went without power, it would be 3 days before it turned into Mad Max. So
mm,
you need electricity
yeah,
to everything. That's how important this is. The cells are no different. So when you burn proteins, fats, and carbs in the presence of oxygen in these little power plants called mitochondria, you make sparks.
mhm,
Make sparks. That's what free radicals are. And so you need in the factory janitors called MN-SOD, catalase, glutathione peroxidase. They run around and put out all the sparks so the factory doesn't, catch on fire. So the head janitor I call Mr. Sod, even though the technique's called MN Sod. So MN
right,
stands for manganese for the nerds out there. But the head janitor is Mr. Sod, and he takes the two free radicals and he sweeps them together and they form hydrogen peroxide. Yeah, the same hydrogen peroxide you get at a store to sterilize things. And
mhm,
then the two sub-janitors, catalase and glutathione peroxidase, then take two hydrogen peroxide molecules and convert it into oxygen and water, which, if you pause to think about it, that is really cool. The body takes free radicals and turns it into oxygen and water. That's amazing. And the genes regulate or decide, are your janitors acting fast or acting slow?
mhm,
So if you have a red dot or a yellow dot, red is very bad, yellow is pretty bad versions, then that means Mr. Sod is not doing so well and needs a lot of extra support.
Mhm.
So people who have, red dots like I do in MN-SOD, I'm way more vulnerable to free radical damage. So I have to do specific nutrigenomic lifestyle diet nutrition things in order to quench the free radicals because I have a much harder time doing that than the regular person. And this would also affect my methylation. So again, pushing back on Gary's assertion that methylation is the most important thing, I don't think that's true at all. I think that it's inflammation, it's free radical damage, and we're going to cover liver detox and vitamin D receptors soon. I think methylation is way down the pecking order. Doesn't mean there's not value in those genes, but in the methylation genes, he says, but I don't think they're the highest, most important ones by far. Uh,
Well,
then we
and so one of the I was just gonna say, you just pulled up that vitamin D slide because I was just about to ask you, you mentioned vitamin D earlier
Mhm.
and how important that was, so I'd love to know
Yeah.
more.
So vitamin D next to water is probably the most important nutrient in the whole body.
Mm,
And the reason I say that is that it's estimated that vitamin D controls between 3 to 5% of the human genome. One molecule, one controls 1/33rd to 1/20th of your entire genome. Now, the most what vitamin D does, it's not just for bone density. That's kind of a thing it does, but the most important thing it does is deal with inflammation and regulate the immune system. So, it also does things for, like, keeping the gut lining stitched together, from preventing from having, being, quote, "leaky," or technically called intestinal permeability. Like, vitamin D has a lot of stuff. There's a lot.
yeah.
At 3 to 5% of the human genome. That's why I'm saying, based on the numbers, it's probably one of the most important molecules in the whole body. Now, making vitamin D from the sun, there's about a half dozen genes between the sun and your bloodstream to convert cholesterol into vitamin D3. I'm not talking about that half of the journey. I'm talking about the second half of the journey, which is once you have vitamin D in the blood, you can get it from sunlight, assuming you've got enough genetic grunt to convert it. You can get it from supplements, you can get it from food.
Mhm.
And it's a matter of getting vitamin D into the cells to do its work on the 3 to 5% of the genome. That's the trick. That's the most important part of the leg is, can you even get it into the cells, not just into the bloodstream? So these are called the vitamin D receptors. The receptors are the docking sites where, if you use your cell and the cell has all these receptors or docking sites on its surface, it's like gates into the city. And the blood is flowing by, and then, like, there's a vitamin D molecule, and it can land on that specific receptor, that specific door, to then go and make the changes inside the cell. That's what the vitamin D receptors are. For people that have red dots, like me, in vitamin D receptors, they have way, way fewer vitamin D receptors on the surface of their cells. So they have a harder time taking up vitamin D and benefiting from it. Now,
That
another,
regardless of source?
I'm sorry, what?
Is that regardless of source?
Yes, it doesn't matter
Oh,
source.
so
Totally
it
relevant.
doesn't matter so, like, you could if you can't uptake, it doesn't matter how much you're taking, you're just not gonna be able to convert it within the system.
Not quite. So let me clarify. There's fewer receptors. So
Mhm,
if you more vitamin D, that means it's more likely vitamin D is going to land on those harder to find receptors. So it's a
mhm.
difference between having a city with 100 gates for vitamin D versus a city with two. And vitamin D is kind of like going around and say, where's the gate? Where's the gate? Where's the gate? And where's the
Yeah.
gate? It's so the goal here is to increase the number of gates for vitamin D. So having more vitamin D will definitely help people with fewer gates because there's less opportunity to get, you want to have more vitamin D going through that gate, those fewer gates, because there's less gates to go through and you need to get vitamin D in there.
So can we take just 1 second and sidestep to talk about the fact that most people, when they test their vitamin D at the doctors, they're getting tested for serum levels, and
Mhm.
that conventional serum levels for vitamin D are much lower than functional levels,
Right.
and that functionally, most functional medicine practitioners are looking at intracellular levels, showing us what's actually osmosing in and out of the cell. So can you address that for a second and talk about the different levels of vitamin D that are
Well, the
optimal for
most
elevate.
most functional docs I know, and what I was trained on was that we want between 60 and 80.
Mm.
And I think it's nanograms per deci. Forgive me
Yeah,
if I'm.
nanograms per deciliter, yeah.
I get the units sometimes. There's so many of them.
I know there's so
Oh,
many, yeah.
Yeah, you can
And so I part of the reason I bring
chat
this
that
up
later.
is I know sometimes people will, they'll go to their doctor and who will run a vitamin D test, and the doctor go, "Oh, you're at 35, you're
Yeah,
fine."
that's way too low. Yeah, so
Yeah.
by the way, the units are different depending on the country you're in. So if like you're if
Oh,
when I was in New Zealand, like there was a different unit system. So there was a different range for
did not know that.
medical normals and functional normals. That's why the units matter. So
Yeah.
um yeah, so the optimal levels for functional purposes is between 60 and 80, but so there's a difference between medical normals and functional optimals. And
Mhm.
that's the short phrase I'd like people to remember. There's medical normals where and functional optimals. Now, medical normals are so Western medicine is a brief other tangent of a tangent. Western medicine philosophically was developed out of triage. It was developed out of military medicine, where we're looking for are you in danger of using your life, limb, or function right now? And this
Mm.
came out of World War One, was there so many injuries, they had to create a triage system to identify who needed immediate care, who was a goner, and who could wait, and who was fine.
Mhm.
And so the philosophy of Western medicine emerged out of that. So the normals that are associated with Western medical normals are associated with risk of acute pathology. So
Mhm.
looking at the outer edges, like let's say, oh, you're fine. By fine means you are not overtly experiencing or displaying a pathological disease state.
Mm.
It's not the same thing as I'm feeling great and optimal, well. And so people can feel terrible, but be quote fine on their blood tests. But the Western medicine philosophically is not looking for are you feeling great or well or optimal? They're looking for are you not overtly diseased?
Mm.
That's the parameters they're setting. So it's functional optimals are as they sound. We're looking at the ranges where people feel and perform the best.
Right.
And so the confusion and the antagonism between Western medicine and natural medicine, or rather functional medicine, is each one accusing the other of having of misplaced ranges, when
Mm.
really we're looking at the same numbers with through a different lens.
That
And
is such a great way to put it. I really like that. They're looking at it through a different lens. That's
totally different lens.
yeah.
And this is where like I have no place in an emergency room.
Mhm.
Zero. So Western medicine was actually developed philosophically as an emergency, literally triage. It's an emergency room philosophy that now has had mission creep into general health and well-being, and the tools they have, drugs and surgery and radiation, are are the tools that are ideally set for acute emergency situations, not
Mhm.
for
Mm.
optimizing somebody. So, and this is where people get territorial over the health and well-being and sandbox. It's like, no, it's not a sandbox. It's actually like a salad bar. Like there's
Right. That's a
like
good way to put it too, yeah.
we have to compartmentalize. Like I have no business in emergency room. Zero,
Mm.
and I find it frustrating when Western medicine encroaches on health and well-being and optimization, but they don't have the tools or the philosophy to actually do anything for it of any real value. So,
Sure.
and it's not to say like the functional medicine I describe as the estuary between natural medicine and Western medicine, because I describe functional medicine as using the best of Western medicine's mm, diagnostic technology combined with the best of natural medicine, lifestyle, diet, nutrition interventions.
Sure. Sure.
That's why it's the estuary, the meeting of salt and fresh water. And that's why I love the field so much. And I'd say like there is a way to have everyone respect their part of the salad bar and be able to collaborate instead of get territorial.
Mhm. That would be ideal if we could learn to do that.
That'd be wonderful. So this is vitamin D. And any other thoughts or questions on the vitamin D?
No, I really like though that you bring up that, vitamin D does play a part in looking at what's going on with methylation, because I think so many people are used to thinking of vitamin D as this one thing that helps with bone health, and really, as you mentioned, it's so much more than that.
So the next piece I want to talk about in terms of methylation is that detox. That again, here's a couple papers showing that at a minimum, it's bidirectional. That heavy metals controls methylation, and at times methylation can influence detoxification. And it's not as simple as just I'm going to get my methylation genes and that's all I need. That is simply not true.
Mm,
So, it's just some more papers on how the detox and for the people watching, what I'm showing here is the 3 most important genes for phase 1 and the 5 most important genes for phase 2 liver detox. And phase 1, phase 2, to simply understand, I learned this from one of my mentors, Dr. Kalish, who I studied with for 4 years. He said the phase 1, phase 2 liver detox system is like a washer dryer.
mm,
So the washer is you got dirty clothes, so that's like the toxin, and you put it in the washer. That's phase 1. So you kind of you get everything really activated and stirred up and like ready to be dried and used again. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is the dryer, where you
mm,
put the wet clothes in the dryer, and if it's dried and then you come up, poof, all good, nice. The problem is that if you've got way too much wet laundry and your dryers are either overwhelmed, there's not enough of them, or they're broken, or they're missing components, then instead of just having dirty laundry, you now have wet laundry that never dries and it gets moldy and worse than if you had
mm,
never put it through the washer to begin with. So benzene is very toxic, but what's even worse than benzene is the benzene oxide radical, which is benzene going through the washer system phase 1, and it gets a radical oxygen species put on it. And so now it's really activated and 100 times worse,
mhm.
damaging,
Yeah.
because it's supposed to be that activated, because then it goes through the dryer and you stick on a giant clunky amino acid group to now make the benzene basically neuter it and then enable to be gotten rid of out of the system, like be pooped out. So the problem is that if you don't have the dryers ready to receive the washers. So when you see red and yellow dots in phase 1, what that means is the washers are now extra fast. So they're pumping out wet laundry faster, and the red and yellow dots in liver means that those dryers are slower. So when you combine
Mm,
faster washers and slower dryers, you have a problem.
mhm.
Have a problem. And so knowing genetically how to calm down the washers and how to support the dryers, that's the goal, epigenetically, for knowing your detox genes.
And this is also a really good time to point out that our bodies detoxify all the time, like, that's just part of our natural function. This is not meant we're not talking here about people being sold a detox kit on the
No.
internet.
No, no, no. No, no, no.
It's just natural, biological process of detoxification. We want that to be working as well as possible.
So the next piece I wanted to bring up that Gary brought up was he insisted that AHCY gene was really important for mood. Now, AHCY is buried right here in the methylation cycle, um, right here in the corner here. And so I went and looked up HCY, and the literature showed that it's actually one of the most conserved genes in mammals across
And so
time.
what does that mean, a conserved
It
gene?
doesn't really change that much. So like looking
Oh,
for variation may not necessarily be that valuable, because there's very, very few people that actually have variations. In fact, one of the criteria for the 100 plus genes I look at is there a minimum 10% variation of the gene in the population? It makes no
mhm,
sense to test for a gene where 0.000 whatever percent of the population has it. I mean, for those people where they do have it, it's important, but it's so rare. You need a real genetics PhD specialist to kind of dig around for that. I'm interested in the top most important genes that are the most important to the most important processes, again, those 7 drivers, and that have a very real chance of showing up in a genetics test. As
mhm.
opposed to people just testing, there's so many bigger companies that test for hundreds, even thousands of genes. And I think for health purposes, I'm not sure there's a lot of diminishing returns there. And
Yeah.
more data is not better. It's better organized and prioritized data is better. And I've seen it. I call it 23 Me syndrome, where people come to me like, "Oh my god, I've got my answer," and they gave me this huge report, and I run it through this algorithm, and I'm just overwhelmed and stressed and scared and confused, and I'm like, "Yeah, because more data is not better. It's we need to prioritize and organize these."
Mhm.
So that, like, for example, methylation is not number 1, inflammation is number 1, and methylation is far underneath it. Like,
Right.
that's what I mean by prioritization. And Gary made this assertion that HCY is real important for mood, and I'm like, "Well, um, sure, but when I'm a pragmatist, like, what is the answer to AHC1? The answer is B3. The end. Like, it's B3, and you'd be getting that anyway in whatever B complex you're doing. So
Mhm.
I don't really see the utility of testing this thing because the answer seems to be the same. Until I'm proven otherwise, like, it's B3 or bust and we're done. So what's the big deal? And the reality is that there's better genes to check for mood called the MAOA genes. There's MAOA1 and MAOA2, and they have, very significant impacts on people's psychological states of being. And I'll just give one example. There's like people can have a green dot in one and a red dot in two. And then the people can have like a reverse and they can have other combinations. And like this one, red dot and MAOA1 and green dot MAOA2, like this combination is uniquely terrible for people to consume alcohol because
Okay.
they have rage. Like
Mhm.
these are your angry alcoholics. And epigenetically, some of the baseline stuff is like exercise and stress management, which is a good strategy for, everything pretty much. Uh, but for mood, and this is one reason why when people incorporate more, if they're not feeling great and they are able to and engage in exercise, they start to feel better. This is one of the reasons why is because they change the epigenetic expression of their MAOA genes. So
Mhm.
so these are genes that I check for in terms of quote mood, not the AHCY, which is
Right.
again 3 proxy anyway. So that's what I wanted to say around methylation. That you know there's many things that are controlling methylation, like inflammation. First off, methylation is bigger than those 5 genes. I mean, this is just that roadmap I showed you of about
Sure.
it's into a dozen and a half. Inflammation controls methylation. Oxidative stress controls methylation. Liver detox controls methylation. Vitamin D utilization controls methylation. Detoxification, controls methylation. And yeah, sure, there's some bidirectionality as well, but there's very clear research showing that these other processes directly control methylation, even if there's some bidirectionality of methylation going the other direction. So I just feel like it was oversimplified the way it was shared on that podcast with Gary and Joe, that you just need these 5 little genes and you're good. I do not agree with that whatsoever. So
Well, and I also like how you shared at the beginning, this is a one-off test. You only ever have to do this once because your genes don't change. And if you are someone who is focusing on improving your diet, your lifestyle to optimize and be as vibrant as possible, it excuse me, it helps to know what your propensity is towards particular dietary interventions or if there's certain nutritional support that your body would benefit from because of your genes and how you're methylating to tell you what the possibility is because inflammation is one of those things that over a period of time will just creep up and up and up and up. So at a certain point it doesn't feel so bad. 10 years down the road, maybe not so great.
absolutely.
So this is definitely a helpful thing for people to understand, and I see you're telling us how we can order them, that's
Yeah.
great.
So the genetics there's lots of genetics tests out there, tons and tons and tons. And what I do is very specific. It's not genes for diseases, it's not genes for your genealogy. It's functional genetics. It's what are the 100 plus genes that are the most important to navigate the drivers of those other problematic genes underneath them. And it also includes major genes on determining optimal diet. So
Mhm.
there's genes that I look at that look at trigger foods, like are you genetically vulnerable to detoxing alcohol, to gluten, to lactose, sugar, and milk? And are you genetically vulnerable to caffeine? Do you get what's
Mhm.
called caffeine-induced anxiety and depression, which I have those genes.
Mm.
And for a lot of people who think they can just stuff as much MCT oil into their coffee, but they're still a jittery mess when they have the coffee, it's that genetically they're not able to tolerate the caffeine no matter how, bulletproof it might be. And I was one of those people. And so caffeine, I can't do caffeine, and I just stopped caffeine. Also, are you genetically vulnerable to histamines? Are you
Mhm.
genetically vulnerable to like salt? And then salt is not just like a blood pressure thing. And there's so many contributors to blood pressure. What I see a lot of the times with people when they've got the variations in the in quote blood pressure, it's actually they retain water. They actually
Mm.
water weight, and, as opposed to, like, having higher blood pressure necessarily. Some do, but I see water weight.
Sure.
Then, eating behaviors, like, are people genetically vulnerable to overeating or over-craving sugar or over-consuming sugar or avoiding bitter foods? And when you get your genes back on that, it's like, "Oh, I guess I can't control my hunger levels, so, oh, well, I might as well give up and just keep eating." It's like, no. If you've got genetic realities around how you control your eating behaviors, what you do is you don't focus. I would teach you not how to increase your willpower. I would teach you how to control your environment. So, in
Mm.
willpower is not an issue. So, if you've got a genetic reality that affects your willpower, don't fight it. Change your willpower so your low willpower wouldn't even matter because there's nothing in the house for you to act out on your
Right.
low willpower. So that's how you can make genes that may give you a bad result that's
Mhm.
permanent, but it's not defeatist. Like there's actual
Sure.
involved. So in terms of what's included, I run a panel of 6 tests all together, and this is a bit more detailed. So there's like finding your ideal diet, keto, paleo, Mediterranean, high carb, or shades of gray in between, knowing your trigger foods, your eating behaviors, looking at your, natural weight. So those 7 drivers I mentioned before, that's actually under the achieve your natural weight. It was just easier to say achieve your natural weight panel than the understand the 7 drivers that like it's way too long a sentence.
Yeah.
So one thing for people to understand is that there are actually 3 I've identified 3 separate genetically based weight gainers. There's
Mm.
the inflammatory water weight gainers, there's the hormonal toxic weight gainers, and then there's the caloric fat weight gainers.
Mm.
So there's a thing called the muffin test as one test where inflammatory weight gainers have a couple obvious signs to what's going on. One is that they eat half a muffin, but they put on 2 to 4 pounds.
Mm.
Now, unless that muffin was last year's regifted Christmas fruitcake, it didn't weigh 2 to 4 pounds.
Yeah.
Right? So what happened is that all the dough conditioners, the sugars, the chemicals, the dough, all the things, the coloring, whatever went into that muffin, that created an inflammatory response in the whole body, and your
Mhm.
body then started to retain water and flood the interstitial spaces between the cells with more water to do what? Dilute the inflammatory chemicals from damaging the tissues and
Mhm.
cells to buy the liver and kidneys time to filter out those damaging inflammatory chemicals. That's what this rapid water weight increase is from eating something as trivial as half a muffin. So there's this rapid increase and rapid decrease in weight day to day, and it's very clear whenever you have different types of foods, if it goes up, if it goes down. This happened with my father where I begged him to try to avoid, grilled cheese on toast for a day and just do vegetables and meat and fat for one day. And after much protest, he did it and he lost 4 pounds in one day. And
Oh.
I was
Oh
no
my goodness.
wait, that was nothing about calories because I saw him,
Yeah.
he ate plenty of calories. What he did was get off all the things that was inflammatory, and he just dropped this chunk of water weight,
Mhm.
and he didn't stay with it because he likes his bread and cheese. So here we are. Now he's suffering
Well,
with
and I would also, share for anybody who's listening, we are all bio-individual, and this is
correct.
where understanding this kind of genetic foundation is so important because all too often, I know I get people come in and, they are upset because their, spouse, neighbor, friend, whatever, did a particular diet and lost massive amounts of weight, and they want to lose weight and they only lost 2 pounds. And it has nothing to do with that. I'm astonished that your dad lost 4 pounds, but I'm also, in a way, not surprised because he dropped the 2 things that were triggering him, and the body was able to shed all of that.
Yeah, and it was specific to his situation.
Right.
Now, tried that strategy with someone who is not suited for a higher fat protein diet, they would feel terrible. I mean, this is a
Mhm.
whole we have a whole separate podcast on the 5 specific layers, genetics being the foundational layer to nuancing into hyper detail someone's optimal diet, but genetics is the foundation of it. That's a whole separate podcast. But
Sure.
getting he that was just a very clear and very strong example of what I mean by inflammatory water weight. Uh,
Yeah.
other people have inflammatory water weight. This is a very unique situation. I actually lectured on some genetics conferences on this, called exercise-induced obesity,
Mm.
meaning that they exercise so much. These are mostly the CrossFit junkies, that they over-exercise and they become pro-inflammatory, and you can always identify them because the more they exercise, the more washed out their muscles look, and they
Mm.
get super frustrated and try to exercise more and more and more, and no matter how many PRs or personal records they reach, they're still not looking trim and fit. They're looking like washed out. And
Yeah.
these are people who are over inflammers and are over triggering inflammatory response from over exercise.
Mm.
And I'm telling you, like getting these exercise addicts to pull back is like getting someone to quit smoking to, down from every day down to twice a week. Like it is a journey to stop some
Mhm.
of these exercise addicts.
Well, it can be an addiction, there's that whole neurotransmitter component to it, and they're probably highly stimulated by that, but that again is a whole other topic we
All the
can.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a hormonal toxic weight. So if you have trouble detoxing and the body will throw toxins into the dirty closets of the body called the fat cells.
Mhm.
And there's people who are caloric fat weight, where it's like it's calories in and they layer on fat cells. Like so there are 3 major types and they require different nutrigenomic and epigenetic lifestyle interventions based on what their gene types are.
Sure.
Then there's the vitamin D, which we talked about in detail. And then there's some immunity support, which includes things like vitamin C and zinc and other things. So for people that are interested, I have a lot of information, some ebooks. I now have
Oh,
a,
I love that.
a mini course for people also when they opt in to get the genetics ebook, where they can learn how to actually implement genetic testing into their lives and be empowered to
Mhm.
get all this critical information for themselves for the short and
Well, and I appreciate how you helped us take a plain English, well, mostly plain English deep dive into, well, because there are certain parts of this that have to be scientific terminology, but really you demystified it, and that's wonderful. So thank you very much for doing that.
thank you.
For everyone who has been watching, thank you so much for sharing all of that amazing information. And for everybody who is watching, I will put the link down below so you can be sure to grab those 3 free ebooks that Dr. Sam is offering us. I do also encourage you to connect with him. That link is also a great way to find out how to do the testing if you're interested in that. And so, hopefully you've learned a lot and opened up your awareness of a whole new aspect of your health and well being. So, thank you for joining us. And Sam, thank you so much for sharing your brilliance. This was really amazing. I love how you put all of this together for us. It was really great. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Mira. Thank you for having me on.
And for everybody who's watching, remember, as always, in all you do, let's make today a healthy day. Bye, folks. Welcome to the One Small Action Step series. Today we are talking with Dr. Sam Shay about his one small step that someone can do for their health and well being. Dr. Sam, what's your tip?
My tip for the short term and the long term is for people to get a comprehensive health and well-being genetics test, because that's going to be the single most valuable thing you can do over the long term, amortized over however many decades you plan on living, to give you a very clear roadmap on what are the inherited genetic fault lines you have to address ahead of time, And also, what is your optimal direction in terms of lifestyle, diet, and nutrition? So, getting a really good genetics test is going to be the highest value thing that you could possibly do over the long term for any of your health, well being, and performance goals.
That's great. So I just want to, clarify, we're not talking 23andMe here, are we?
No, 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 no. But 23andMe has a lot of value in it. The issue is not the issue is not the volume of data. It's how well that data is organized and prioritized for your specific needs. If I test 1,000 genes, but they're all equally thought of as equally important, I would get a report back or plug it through some algorithm on a phone and like, oh my God, I have all these things and they're all important. So I'm overwhelmed, confused, and scared, and I don't know what to do. Versus getting a very specific type of health test, a genetic health and well-being panel that is looking at the most important 100 or so genes as
Mhm.
it relates to long-term health and well-being, so that you can look at a prioritized list of things to do for the long term, as opposed to swimming in this giant miasm of hundreds of overwhelming genes. And not other genes are important, but I want to look at the most important genes first and start there because they will control the other genes underneath them.
That is such a great tip. Thank you so much for sharing. So there you go. Dr. Sam's number one thing that you can do is a once in a lifetime, it's all you need, genetic test that looks at the most important factors that drive your health and well-being. Thank you, Dr. Sam. Thanks for being here, folks. Bye.